Very good. Welcome, Mr. Solomon, and congratulations on your selection by the NBCC.
Thank you.
Your very readable and accessible 700-page book, Far from the Tree, Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity, synthesizes the experience of parents, the so-called normal vertical parent, who embrace their shockingly different offspring. You've spent 10 years with parents of exceptional children who are disabled, dwarf, transgender, criminals, prodigies, deaf, schizophrenics, Down syndrome, autistic, and children born of rape. What is the primary insight you've gleaned from your research? What is it about the way these parents raised very challenging children who were so dramatically different from themselves or their own family tree that gives you hope for the human race?
Hope for the human race. Okay. I think really I was interested in the idea that there are many kinds of identity that are passed down generationally. So ethnicity, nationality, often language, often religion, those are things that most children have in common with their parents. But there are other things that children have identities that are foreign to their parents. So most gay kids are born to straight parents, most dwarfs are born to parents of average height, most parents of people with autism don't themselves have autism. And I was very interested in the idea that those conditions are ones that parents by and large will seek to cure, and then that some of them are conditions that the people who are touched by them will eventually come to assert as identities. So over a period of time, people discover a community of others who are in the same situation as themselves, and when they find that context, they emerge into a sense of pride and a sense of identity. And then their parents have to struggle with, do we continue to treat this as an illness, or do we begin to treat it as an identity? And when you ask about hope for humankind, which is a rather grand idea, but what I found extraordinary was the way in which so many of these conditions, which at one point were assumed to be only illnesses, are now often treated as identities. And I became very interested in trying to understand what allows something to shift. And I drew from my own experience, which is that when I was a gay kid, I thought I had an illness, and so did most of the people around me. And now, with a husband and children, I think I have an identity, and it's a very different life than I was able to imagine. It was an unimaginable life then, and I thought if people like me can make that radical shift and can end up with much happier lives than we thought lay ahead for us, then who else is in that category and could make that shift? And examining that question, I think, is the nexus of the hope in the book.
Very exciting one.
Yeah.
How did you choose these 10 groups? And did you consider adoptees? Why or why not?
I chose the 10 groups because I wanted to look at a constellation of experience. So I felt that if I was writing about the deaf, I didn't need to write about the blind, even though the blind were quite similar. I felt that if I was writing about dwarfs, I didn't need to write about gigantism. So there was a certain amount of focusing on groups that would fill out the constellation of different experiences. The first half of the book are things that have generally been perceived as illnesses. So deafness, dwarfism, Down syndrome, autism, schizophrenia, and multiple severe disabilities. And the second half is things that have been perceived as identities in some way. So prodigies, people bringing up children conceived in rape, families of people who commit crimes, and families of people who are transgender. And I felt that in using those two halves, I could describe the full range of experience that exists in this world of difference. One of the chapters I planned but ultimately cut because, as you pointed out, it's quite a chunky book even at its current length, was about families who set out to adopt disabled children, and there are lots of adopted children in the course of the book. But essentially, I didn't feel that adoption overall as a general category involved necessarily the identity gap that there was in the other areas I was examining.
Okay. Do you feel less lonely in your horizontal identity as a gay man since you've completed the book and become a parent?
That's a terrific question. I definitely do feel less lonely. The real revelation of the book was that while each of these identity conditions individually can be quite lonely, so there are only so many people who are dealing with schizophrenia, there are only so many families dealing with a child with autism, ultimately the experience of families dealing with children who are somehow different is actually an overarching and embracing experience, and it applies to a vast array of people going through a vast array of experiences. And I ended up feeling enormous kinship with all the groups I wrote about. When I started, I think I found them intimidating, some of them scary, some of them very off-putting, and I ended up thinking, oh, my experience and the experience of my family is very related to the experiences of all these other families. And that was kind of a revelation. And I did end up feeling less lonely. Then, of course, having a family makes one inherently feel somewhat less lonely, but I felt in having a family, I thought my family will be a little different from the mainstream in some ways. I thought, but so are all of these other families, and look how much love there is in them. It gave me the courage to go forward. People said to me, it's extraordinary you decided to have children in the midst of writing a book about everything that can go wrong. And I said that for me it wasn't a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about how even when everything does go wrong, there's so much love and so much joy that can be found in the experience of having a family.
Congratulations
Thank
on
you.
having a family.
Thank you very much.
This has to do with the going back to the Columbine
Right.
shooting in 1999. You interviewed one of the shooter's parents, Tom and Sue Klebold. In the interview, it caused the American right to blame the collapse of family values and the American left to mount assaults on violence in movies and seek to tighten gun control laws. That was kind of a long time ago. These responses seem eerily familiar since the December shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School. What do you hope, in terms of public policy, will come out of the Sandy Hook incident? And if you had a position, like if you were a wizard in the US and had a magic wand, what would be the first, second, and third things you would do to affect change, public policy, public sentiment about these families?
So I love the idea of being a wizard with a magic wand, and I think the first thing I would do is to get rid of all the guns. I'm a dual national. I lived part of the time in the UK. I'm originally American. I lived part of the time in another society where people just can't get their hands on guns, and there's a lot less gun violence in such a society. Not only a lot less homicide, but also a great deal less suicide. And I think in looking at Sandy Hook, what we have to look at is the mental health issues that there clearly were for Adam Lanza. He seems to have been someone who looked like he was troubled. Nobody seems to have done anything about it. So the second thing I do with the magic wand is to get a robust and accessible mental health system. And the third thing I think I would do is to provide some kind of support to families so that a family that sees a child who seems to be headed in a tragic direction will have the means, the ability, and the scope to find treatment, to recognize what's going on, and then if the child doesn't have access to guns, if he'd gone into that school with a knife, Adam Lanza would not have caused the same kind of destruction. It wouldn't have been great, but it wouldn't have been anything like as bad as it was. So I think those are the things I would do. And my experience talking to Tom and Sue Klebold, which was one of the most moving things that I experienced working on the book, was that I went into their house thinking, when I really get to know these people, I'll understand what went wrong and why their child ended up doing this. And the more time I spent with them, the more bewildered I was. And what I ultimately felt was that the experience of raising a child with criminal tendencies is not necessarily something that has to do with the parents. We used to blame parents for their children's autism and schizophrenia. We used to blame gayness on overbearing mothers. We used to have this whole catalog of things that we blame people for, and we've stopped blaming people for all of those things. And it's time to stop being so focused on blaming people in general and the family in particular for these problems, and to look at the things in our system and in our way of life that allow for them.
Very good. Do you feel there's a specific kind of model? Do we need more parent education? There are, when parents come up against this, when I have a friend who works in at a preschool level, and where there's screening going on, preschool and also in the elementary level, parents do not want to hear that their children have any differences, and they fight to have help.
Right.
Even when it's offered at an early stage. There's a stigma attached to all of this. There's a stigma to mental health. There's a stigma to these disabilities of all kinds.
Look, there's a huge stigma to having a child who's actually murdered a lot of people in his school. And when I did the chapter on crime, I was struck by how much parents struggled with the experience of having produced such children. I always remember toward the end of my first long weekend with the Klebold's that I said to them, and we'd recorded something like 20 hours of interviews over a weekend. I said to them, if Dylan were here now and you could actually talk to him again, do you have a sense of what you'd want to ask him? And his father said, I sure do. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother looked at the floor, she thought for a minute, and then she looked back up and said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And I think if we had a better system, parents would be better able to see the problems. I think if we screened the kids, we would be able to do more for them. And I hope that over time, the courage of people like the Klebold's and coming out and telling their stories will reduce the stigma. Because if we stopped blaming parents so much, the stigma would be much less than it is.
Excellent, excellent. How and at what point did you come up with the idea of horizontal and vertical identities? If in the book it is the vertical identities, maybe you can explain that a little bit.
Sure.
And then the horizontal identities, and at what point in your research did you just come up and say, okay, this is how I'm going to organize it? Because it's a pretty big.
So the vertical identities, as I said before, are the ones that are hereditary. They come from your parents, your ethnicity, your religion, your language, your nationality. And the horizontal ones are the ones that you essentially acquire from a peer group. So you grow up thinking, I'm kind of broken, I'm deaf, I'm kind of broken, I'm gay, I'm kind of broken, I'm transgender or autistic or whatever it is. And then in adolescence, usually, or sometimes just afterwards, you begin to find others who share your condition. And because they're learned from a peer group, I called them horizontal identities. And the language to describe them came to me quite late. It was when I was doing some reading in psychoanalysis, which used those terms in a slightly different way, but they seem nonetheless very vivid to me. But the basic theme of trying to understand how people emerge into a coherent sense of self when they're so different from their parents that their parents can't create that, that was there from the very start of the project.
It was.
Yes.
Impressive. Who was your most important teacher? Mentor?
My most important teacher was Harold Bloom, who was my advisor for my senior essay in college. Harold Bloom and then Juliet Mitchell, who's been my advisor. I'm in the middle of doing a doctorate in psychology, and she's my advisor for that. They both are people who have got an enormously broad and encompassing vision of the world. So I always feel that when I get a bit of Harold's wisdom, or Juliet's really, they're quite similar in that regard, that one has insight not only into the specific topic of conversation, but also into a vision of how everything connects, how art and literature and the unconscious mind and the conscious mind are interlinked. And I feel very lucky to have been exposed to that, and very lucky to have had some tutelage in how to get your small insights to fit together into something that's larger and more significant. Not that I can do it at their level, I can't, but they were both extraordinary inspirations to me, and I'm very grateful to them both.
Great, great. And what are you reading now? And and what are you reading to your son? What's your son's favorite book?
Oh, my son's favorite book, he has so many of them at the moment, but I have been starting him on Winnie the Pooh, which I read when I was little, and I know it's not the most subtle, surprising, astonishing answer, but the stories are still the original ones. There's something so gentle and so kind in them. I feel as though the voice of those stories is a voice that I would love for him to model some of his behavior on. And for myself, I've just finished reading The Examined Life by Stephen Gross, which came out in England recently and will come out here soon, which is a wonderful digest of how psychoanalytic insight can be applied to the ordinary experiences of daily life. It's a beautiful and moving book.
Okay. And I do wonder, have you had criticism of your book, your ideas in the course of, you've been doing some book touring over to India? What has been the response? Are people coming and protesting you, or are they, what is the response to your book?
Like anyone who publishes a book, I get both letters of glorious support and letters of fierce and appalling criticism. So I've encountered both of those experiences.
Okay.
I've had a lot of people who've written to me and who've said, I had these experiences in which I felt so alone, and I've read your book and I feel less alone, and that's the most gratifying response I can get. And I've also had people who've said this is all hogwash, especially about the people who commit crimes, people who are still very focused on blame, and so they want to blame the parents, and some of them want to blame me, and it can be wearing some of the time. I think also the book's basic message is about the embrace of difference, and there are some people who are very uncomfortable with the embrace of difference. I think that the embrace of difference is essentially a joyful process, and I've argued strongly in favor of it. But I do recognize that not everyone sees it that way, and I've had to recognize that because some of the ones who don't have been in touch to tell me so.
They're not quiet about it. Is there a question or topic that no one has asked you yet that you wish someone would?
I think in a way the topic that's really been interesting for me is how much this book was the necessary condition of my having children, and how much my having children became necessary to the way I narrated the book. That those things are very much entwined. The final chapter of the book is partly about my experience of having children, so it's dealt with explicitly in the book, but I do feel that meeting all of these people was humbling and made me a kinder person, and having children is more humbling than anything.
That is for sure. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much
My
for
pleasure.
joining us today, and we wish you the best of luck.
Well, thank you.
And thanks again.
This has been a pleasure. Thank
It
you.
has been a pleasure.